I'm very happy to be with you today, and I'm very grateful to the organizers of this conference and all the people that I've met. Been so gracious. What I want to do is to present to you something a little different than what I usually do, and certainly maybe a little different than what's going on so far in this conference, because I want to talk to you about some of the sort of social and cultural aspects of abortion, and particularly as it relates to same-sex parenting. This is the abstract. I'm going to skip that. You've got it in your program, and it's really on there. If you want these slides, if you send me an email after this presentation, I'll be happy to send them to you. My email address will be on the last slide. I'll also put in a folder all of the articles that I refer to during the presentation. We talk about gay rights, the gay rights movement. We also talk about the abortion rights movement. And for most pro-life people, those are two separate things. And I really began to think about this a few years ago when I proposed to submit an article to a pro-life journal about the gay rights movement. And the editor wrote back and said, well, gay rights is not a pro-life issue. And so I said, okay, I won't write the article that I was originally going to write. I want to write an article showing that gay rights is a pro-life issue. And so he allowed that conversation to go on. And so if you think about why we talk about abortion as a life issue, we call it a life issue because it's like infanticide or euthanasia, because it takes a human life. People who do counseling at abortion clinics want to talk about saving a human life. And so that's an important fact. But if you really think about it, we think it's a life issue because it's really a death issue. It threatens a human life. And abortion is a preeminent life issue for many because it threatens or it takes the greatest number of human lives. Legal abortion is even more so a life issue because it devalues human life, literally dehumanizes a human life. Folk like Peter Singer argue that an unborn child is alive but not a person. And so we get to choose whether we live in a society where only some people get to be persons or everybody is a person. Everybody is invested with human dignity and value and worth. And so pro-lifers want to choose the latter type of world. But abortion is also a life issue because, unlike euthanasia or even infanticide, it prevents the natural progression of human life from sexual union. And as a result of this, abortion introduces into human sexual behavior the prospect of not having children. It introduces what we call moral hazard as a result of this. When men and women don't have to think about children when they think about sex, it changes sexual behavior and in ways that constrain and harm human life. This cultural indirect effect of abortion is much more powerful than the direct harm caused by taking so many human lives. In this way, in this sense, abortion is related to contraception and to same-sex relations. Now, to understand that a little more clearly, here we have in the Casey decision, many of you are familiar with, 1992, that reaffirmed abortion in the United States. It said that one of the reasons we have to continue with legal abortion is because so many women have depended on that in order to arrange their lives. We call this the reliance issue. And in that issue, it noticed that in some critical respects, the abortion decision is of the same character as the decision to use contraception. So it recognized that there was this kind of a link, a decisional cultural link between abortion and the use of contraception. We also know repeated empirical studies, I've done a couple myself, that confirm that most abortions follow contraceptive failure. And so there's this link between the kind of decision that goes into having sex without with the imposition or the use of artificial birth control and the kind of decision that goes into having an abortion or ordering one's life on the availability of abortion. So you can extend this idea of contraception and abortion and that link to also include homosexuality. Now, I call this, in this paper, that is kind of the basis of all this, and which is in that folder if you want it, aborting sex. And I call this the contraception, abortion, homosexuality complex. If I was writing that paper again today, I would want to add in something about transgenderism, because we've moved on beyond those. But all of those practices are similar and are related practices, and all of them are inimical to life because they all constrain or limit the natural operation of the body, specifically fertility in women's bodies, in pursuit of this ethic of unconstrained sexual expression, where we're pursuing this ideal that the realm of bodily autonomy is expanded toward unconditioned freedom. We no longer have to conform our lives to the limits of the body, but we exercise choice that transcend the limits of the body, and that's living the good life and living an authentic life. So all of these practices in practice try to reduce the contingencies or the complications of sexual relation in order to result in a more predictable, individual, isolated form of expression, just in line with capitalistic modernity. In contraception, a woman and her partner can enjoy sexual relations without the complication of a pregnancy. They exercise more control. In abortion, she can enjoy sexual relations with the assurance that they'll be without the complication of a child. Now, later on, I'm going to say that's a false assurance, but that's the assurance they rely on. And in homosexuality, she can enjoy sexual relations without even the complication of a man. And so there's this progression toward increasingly controlling and individualizing the sexual experience that shows up in all of these things. Now, the expression of this with regard to marriage, or the same idea lies behind this idea of a marriage as a committed relationship. I get this phrase from the Proposition 8 strikedown in California, where it says that it's not right, they say, to strip gays and lesbians of their right to use the official designation that the state and society give to committed relationships, thereby adversely affecting them. And so in the mind of the court, Judge Walker, a marriage was committed relationship. Nothing more than that. It was a bare kind of understanding. And the U.S. Supreme Court picked up this idea in the Obergefell decision and located the essence of marriage in the affective bonds and commitments that explicitly were unrelated to human sexuality. And so it's that kind of marriage that is now open to persons regardless of their sexual orientation, their sexual behavior, and even regardless of their sex itself. As opposed to that, we have the long traditional religious view of natural marriage. Natural marriage is a social arrangement that's designed to ensure justice and promote the well-being of the relations of sexual partners and, is the important addition, any resulting children. Thomas Aquinas says that the problem with sex relations outside of marriage is that they violate justice. And in order to achieve justice, a man and a woman have to be entered into a marriage. And I have here the kind of requirements of that, which I will not go into. I'm sure they're well known to you. But what natural marriage does, the biggest justice it does is not justice to the two partners. Now, Aquinas says it's an injustice to the woman if a man has sex with her outside of marriage. That's true. But it's even more an injustice to the child that may be produced by that union. And so what natural marriage does is to orient adult desire to the care of children. And so the requirements of marriage each do this in some way. The requirement that there's a man and a woman. That's a hugely important requirement for children. So children have the care of both parents and both kinds of parents. The conjugal sex relations of natural marriage are exclusive. Why? So children can know who their parents are. It's also in a way so that men can know who their children are, but mostly the former. They're permanent so that children can depend on the reliable care of their parents until they're old enough not to need that anymore. And also so that parents can rely on the care of their children in old age. That was a traditional understanding of marriage. There's a public recognition of the relationship to ensure really inheritance, so that people knew that the property that was collected would go to the right place. And then there's joint and mutual responsibility for the children, so that children, by means of natural marriage, are ensured the access of the care of both parents. Committed relationship marriage, it does pretty much the opposite. In committed relationship marriage, you can have two people of either sex, so that who you love is not limited by biology or gender. There's emotional and financial interdependence as part of that. So there's mutual support for the adults, a public declaration so that their relationship is validated and certified. It may or may not include their non-mutual children, but it doesn't require permanence, which is important for the children, but not so much for the adults. It doesn't require sexual exclusivity. The majority of same-sex male marriages are not sexually exclusive. It doesn't require joint responsibility for offspring. All same-sex marriages, I'm going to point out in a minute, exclude at least one of the natural parents. Joint offspring are not possible in a same-sex marriage. So we've moved from natural marriage to committed relationship. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. I'm going to come back to this point later, the trend away from natural marriage. In the debate or the discussion over what kind of marriage we have, natural or committed relationship, both sides agree on one thing: how the children turn out is critical. Evan Wolfson, in his book Why Marriage Matters, which is really the kind of the Bible of the marriage equality movement, he devotes an entire chapter to defending the claim that children suffer no relative harm with same-sex parents, other than the harm related to the fact that their parents are not married, of course. And in the Obergefell decision, the U.S. Supreme Court picked up this reasoning and affirmed that the children would not be harmed. The American Psychological Association stated that the well-being of children are unrelated to parents' sexual orientation. The children of lesbian and gay parents are as likely as those of heterosexual parents to flourish. Now, I could replicate this saying in a dozen other political organizations, scientific organizations. And as we've heard here already today a number of times, those statements turn out to be very different when you actually look at the research. And the AAPA claim is also emphatically false. I'm just going to go into that a little, give you a little taste of that research here, because I want to focus on this other issue. You could think of the move to committed relationships as a progression of pushing the natural biological parents away from their children, right? You start with this arrangement. In the research literature, this is usually classified as intact married biological parents. The CDC actually calls this a nuclear family, even to this day, where you have a man and a woman and their own biological offspring. But when we move away from that pattern, then we move to one where they can break up, and you get this arrangement. Usually it's a single mother. The problem with this arrangement is that the father now, who's naturally has to be part of that affair or that arrangement, is excluded. the children now have an unnatural relationship with the father. They may go visit him. It may be scripted. He is not a very strong part of their life. There's also single fathers, but there are 10 times as many single mother families as there are single father families. The same thing happens to the mother in the other type of arrangement. And then you can also have the development of a step-parent, married or unmarried family, where one of these two will marry again, introducing another figure of the opposite sex, but still excluding the actual father. In this case, I'm just using the woman remarrying as an example, which is the most common. And now you also have this kind of shadow figure. Is this a father? Is this a friend? Is this an older brother? It turns out that moving from this kind of arrangement to this kind of arrangement increases harm for the children. They have to cope or function with this new kind of relationship. Getting married again doesn't restore this. It moves further away from this. And then we have the movement toward same-sex parents, same-sex male, same-sex female parents, which moves even further away. Now, we have a mountain of research that tells us that when we compare all these family structures, the one in which children turn out best is a family headed by, here I'm quoting, 2 biological parents in a low-conflict marriage. So that children in single-parent families, step-families, cohabiting relationship face higher risk of poor outcomes than children in any other kind of family arrangement. This is a conclusion that was published by Child's Trend back in 2002. It still is true today. It's been affirmed many times. Child's Trend is a kind of liberal child advocacy organization. We can think of this as stepping away from nature, right? We start with impact married biological parents, and then as I've shown, we move away to unmarried cohabiting, step, unmarried step, single father. We move further and further away from the natural order of things. Now, my hypothesis is, if this is a correct way of looking at marriage, if natural marriage is really a better idea than committed relationship marriage, and if it's true that how the children turn out matters, then we would expect child well-being to decrease systematically as we move away from natural fathers or partners and child-centered obligations. Whereby, if committed relationship is correct, then we would expect child well-being to be generally pretty much the same across all of these family types. So this forms kind of the crux of the debate in which I do most of my research. Children have the benefit of their own 2 parents with intact married parents always. They're in the continual care of their parents from birth. Usually we measure it to age 18 with no break. And so they always have access to the care of those parents. Some are better than others, but they have that. With cohabiting single or step relationships, in which there's a defection from that, that care may be temporary. Often it's rare. They may not have much, if any, contact with one or more of their biological parents. But with same-sex partners, you have this new development where you have a form of marriage in which the children never have contact or are in the care of at least one of their biological parents. About 2/3 of children who are with what we call same-sex parents are the biological offspring of one of those partners and have kind of a step-parent or a social parent relationship with the other partner. And that's the best case. The other case would be where the child is jointly adopted or it comes by insemination, which involves neither one of the parents. Well, I guess insemination would involve one of them. So how are the outcomes? Well, this is a study I did back in 2015 that just compared opposite sex and same-sex parents without breaking it out by family structure. And so overall, the blue bars are children with the same-sex parents. The brown bars are the children with the opposite-sex parents. This is reporting on the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire, which is the world's most widely used measure of non-specific emotional distress in children. It's a very good predictor of whether or not a child is going to have some psychological difficulty. It doesn't predict exactly what kind. And it's used in most public health surveys in the industrialized world. And on this measure, you can see that the rate of risk, we might say, for clinical emotional problems, 7.4% if the child has man-woman parents, and it more than doubles, 17.4%, if the child has 2 men or 2 women as a parent. Now, this general finding is replicated again and again in a number of measures. There's approximately twice the risk of suffering some emotional distress for the children with same-sex parents. If we look at developmental disability, ADHD, learning disability, some sort of intellectual disability, again, it's about twice the risk. They had a question on the survey: has the child received medical treatment for an emotional problem in the past year? And so this is kind of a sensitivity check on the SDQ. And it turns out there's a much higher rate for the children with same-sex parents for that. They asked, has the child been prescribed medication for an emotional problem in the past year? And with same-sex parents, they were 3 times more likely to have been prescribed medication. So this finding establishes that there is a difference, that there are difficulties for children with emotional problems. And for that reason, and because it uses a very large sample and all of the contrasts are statistically significant, it has been roundly criticized and discredited in lots of ways. But it has also been read thousands of times worldwide and really presents, I think what even people on both sides of the debate would agree is some of the strongest evidence to date that there are difficulties that need to be addressed for children when they have 2 parents of the same sex. Now, I explored in this the differences by family structure. My critics say, no, I ignored family structure, but it's right there in the paper. And these are the results that I reported. And as you can see, we have this kind of trend that I'm predicting as we move away from the natural family. With 2 married biological parents, under 5% of children are considered to be at risk for emotional problems. Now, what was it overall? We'll go back. It was 7.4. So it's lower if those 2 opposite-sex parents are married. It's also much more likely that both of those parents are the joint biological parents of the children. In a blended or step family, it goes up. Cohabiting partners goes up a little more. Single parent, a little bit higher. The same-sex couple, it goes up even more. So we have that a kind of a nice progression that follows that theory right across. I looked at whether or not this could be explained simply by biological parentage. I was using the National Health Interview Survey, which is the largest public health survey in the world. I find a lot of people not heard of it, but the US government has been administering this survey since the late 1950s and interviewing about 100,000 Americans each year. And so we have millions and millions of cases here. It's all publicly available data. And I had to go back a number of years, in this case 17 years, aggregated enough data to have a good sample of children with same-sex parents. I had over 200,000 children overall, which yielded just over 500 children with same-sex parents. It was very, very difficult to get a large sample or a dispositive sample in this population. So they have great questions that ask whether the person that they're interviewing in the home is the biological parent of any of the children in the home. And then when you put that all together, you can see what kind of arrangement it is. In the homes in which both parents are biological parents, you have even lower than if they're married parents, right? You have the lowest outcome that I found in doing this. Just over 4% are measured at risk for emotional problems. I put on this one the confidence intervals. You can see they're very small here. If there's just one biological parent, it's higher. If there are no biological parents, it's substantially higher. Now, this chart doesn't break out same-sex versus opposite-sex parents, right? But if you think about it, it explains why there's much higher distress with same-sex parents. Because how many same-sex parents are in this category? How many families in which you have two men or two women, both of those men or both of those women are the joint biological parents of that child? Well, the answer is 0. It's physically impossible to do. Believe it or not, I couldn't convince the scientists who were reviewing and responding to this study that that was the case. Thank you. So I had to show them empirically. I said, well, look, here's the data. You look at this survey, there are none there. It may be in some fantasy world that it could happen, but it actually hasn't happened yet in the United States. One biological parent, it goes up, and no biological parents, it goes up even more. So all of the same-sex parent families that we know of are in these categories here. None of them are down here. It turns out 2/3 of children that are with opposite-sex parents are in this category here. So that's why these outcomes are so different. I'm going to skip this. This gets more complicated. In my current research, I'm breaking out these findings by the sex of the parent. And so here you can see that outcomes are, distress is a little higher with same-sex male parents, a little lower with same-sex female parents. In fact, almost all the children who have same-sex parents really have lesbian parents. Over 80% of the children in any sample are with lesbians, and it's often much higher than that. So most of the research that we have looks at children with two mothers. Here is a chart from the National Incidence Study on Child Abuse. And I'm just showing this because you have a similar trend. This doesn't include same-sex families, but here you see with married biological parents the rate of all causes abuse, and here it is broken out into physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. Very, very small compared to the other family forms. The highest is when you have a single parent with a partner. This would be a unmarried step-parent kind of arrangement. Usually that step-parent is a man in the home, and so you have an unrelated male adult in which you have much, much higher rates of all these forms of abuse. The same thing with this measure, more or less. This is being expended from school. Sometimes the immediate categories are different. Here's youth incarceration, same thing. Intact married parents, very low. By the time you get to the stepmother, stepfather family, it's much higher. Here you have lowest in the intact married, it goes up. Here you have grade point average in school, such a sort of an average kind of measure, but here you can see it's higher with intact married parents. So on and on across these things. One of the interesting things I found with same-sex parents is that when the same-sex parents are married, the rates of harm actually increase compared to same-sex parents who are not married. It's a counterintuitive finding. And why that is the case is complicated. I talk about it in one of the papers in the folder, but I was able to not only show that, but get another secular scholar to retract those findings where they had published that that was not the case. I showed that they had done some things that you shouldn't really be doing with the data, and they controlled for biological parentage. And so I said, you know, if you're comparing same-sex and opposite-sex married parent families and you control for biological parentage, you're basically controlling for the thing that causes the differences. And it's really not an appropriate control. It's kind of like comparing racial differences and controlling for skin color. You've controlled away most of the variation there. So of course you're going to find no differences. So when they took out that control and they republished their findings, they didn't want to retract, so they republished. they had results that are very similar. So here you have same-sex married parents have almost 5 times the rate of emotional problems compared to the comparison reference group here is opposite sex married parents. And they found pretty much the same thing, a little bit lower, 4.2. I'm going to skip all this. I want to make these points. We talk about fake news, fake stuff. We talk about gay marriage is really fake parents, people that look like parents but really aren't. In fact, it institutionalizes just the thing that parents should not be. But committed relationship marriage is also a fake marriage. It has none of the real qualities that marriage should have. Divorce is actually fake dissolution. No child would claim that if their parent got divorced and then was replaced with a gay non-parent, that somehow took away or revoked the parentage of his or her own natural father or mother. Any more than when we say that an abortion would negate a child's existence. We say an abortion terminates, takes away that child's existence. So the idea of divorce is a fake idea. The pill is fake contraception. It doesn't really work, as many of you will know even better than I do. So we have moved away from marriage, not just in the United States, but worldwide, throughout the world, in the last 50, 60 years. We are winning in many ways on the abortion front. And I want to just point out this contrasting conclusion that we are having great progress on abortion. We're not having progress on marriage. And if we have progress on abortion but not on marriage, then we're losing the cultural issue that will really keep abortions eliminated from our society. So here are the abortion rates. They've dropped dramatically all across the board in the last 40, 50 years. But so has the rate of marriage dropped dramatically all across the board. We're losing on the marriage front. This is the abortion propensity. That's a percentage of pregnancies that end in divorce for teenagers. It's gone up and now has come way down. So we're winning on that front. This is the percent of men between the ages of 25 and 50 in the US that are married. And it has dropped from 75% at the end of the 1970s to most recently much lower, just a little over 55%. We're losing on the marriage front. Births to unmarried women have been going up, rising all across the board. Today, 40% of births are to women who are not married. In 1960, that was only 5%. So somehow marriage is becoming decoupled from having children. We're losing on that front. Push the wrong one. Teens are becoming less sexually promiscuous. We're helping in sexual behavior. They're also dating much less. And so while our young people are kind of, in a way, seeking for a more natural conservative expression of their sexuality, they aren't learning how to connect that with marriage and lifelong relationships. The flight from marriage is increasingly enabled by participation in abortion. This is the ratio of abortions to unmarried to married women. So just under 3 abortions in the 1970s were to unmarried women compared to married women. Today, that ratio is almost twice as many. So you could say marriage is more protective against abortion today, or you could say not being married exposes to a greater possibility. So here are some of the studies that were referenced. Here's the email addresses that I promised you at the beginning. Thank you so much for your attention.